Good morning. It is 9 o'clock Central Standard Time, uh, March the 10th, 2021. We want to say a very special welcome to Molina High School and welcome to the Dallas STEM Environmental Education Center virtual field trip. Teachers, if you're watching and you have not signed up, please register by going to www.tiny.cc/EEC register. Sign up. This is just for our numbers, nothing else. Thank you. Today we're going to do altered food chains. During this virtual field trip, students will predict how the introduction or removal of an invasive species may alter the food chain and affect existing populations in an ecosystem, and predict how species extinction may alter the food chain and affect existing populations in an ecosystem. Ms. Ramirez will do plant species extinction and ecosystems. Ms. Fuller will do animal species extinction and ecosystems. Ms. Nash will talk about invasive plants, and Mr. Monroe will do invasive animals. Now, during this program, you cannot speak to us verbally, but you can go to www.tiny.cc/EEC /question/answer and send in your questions. We'll do our very best to answer them. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Ms. Ramirez is going to tell you all about plant examples for species extinction affecting ecosystem.
Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and in this segment, we're going to be learning about plant extinctions. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you guys, and then we'll get started with our presentation. Might take me just a second to get that screen share back going. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is our essential question for this segment. So hopefully by the end of this segment, you guys will be able to describe how the extinction of a plant species may alter the food chain and affect existing populations in an ecosystem. So keep that question in mind as we go through this segment. You'll be asked to answer that at the end. So just some quick facts about some of the pictures that you're seeing on our slide. In the past 2 centuries, human population growth has accelerated so much that the rate of extinctions has also increased. And that's because of destruction of habitat, introduction of non-native species, pollution, and over-harvesting. And now, typically, when we think of species extinction, we always think of animals because they seem more personable and able to relate to us because some of them look cute. But actually, within the past 250 years, we've lost over 600 plant species. So sometimes those plants often get overshadowed by those cute animals. So take a look at some of these pictures that we have here on the bottom. The first one is the banded Trinity plant. It lived mostly underground and it fed on fungus. And it went extinct in 1916. So this specimen that you're seeing here is a preserved specimen that is in a museum. And this species was only found in a particular area of Chicago near Lake Calumet. So that's a pretty interesting plant that is unfortunately no longer here. And then we have the St. Helena olive that disappeared from the wild in 1994. It became extinct though in 2003. And that's because in between 1994 and 2003, they actually had cultivated ones in labs, but however, those got infected by a fungal infection and it wiped out those remaining specimens. So they finally went extinct permanently in 2003. And then the other one is the Chile sandalwood, and that one went extinct in 1908. And that was primarily due to over-harvesting for its aromatic wood. And you might be familiar with sandalwood because a lot of like shampoos and soaps for men are made out of another species of sandalwood because it has that fragrant smell that's used in a lot of men's products. And then a couple more examples. We have some plants that are extinct in the wild. So for example, the alula from Hawaii, it's the natural pollinator of this plant, the hawk moth, went extinct. And because its pollinator, that special moth, went extinct, this plant also went extinct because it lost its pollinator, so it couldn't reproduce. So that's kind of like the domino effect of how species extinction can affect not just the species itself, but other species that surround it. So now it's extinct in the wild, but there's actually greenhouses and laboratories that still have this plant and they grow it specifically, but it's not found in the wild anymore. And this, I found it to be pretty cool because botanists, they now hand pollinate these plants and they collect the seeds. And again, it's only grown in greenhouses. So I thought it was interesting to see the extent to which scientists are going to try and keep these species alive by hand pollinating them. And then this one is angel's tears. Again, it's extinct in the wild, but they can be found in nurseries, greenhouses, and labs. And it's originally from Brazil. And it's also known as the trumpet of death because all parts of it are toxic. But it went extinct in the wild because it also lost its pollinators. Another reason why it went extinct in the wild was because it was over harvested. So remember I said that it's all parts of this plant are toxic. Well, people were over harvesting them because people were using this plant for its hallucinogenic compounds. So it was over harvested essentially to extinction. But again, scientists now only grow them in greenhouses and places like that. The other part that we're going to talk about are specialist species. And a specialist species is just an organism that requires very specific and unique resources. And they have a very limited diet or a specific habitat need that they need in order to survive. So we are all familiar with the koalas. They have a super highly selective diet and they specialize in eating only the eucalyptus leaves. And some species of koala are super specific that they will only eat a specific species of eucalyptus tree. So imagine if the eucalyptus were to become endangered or extinct. What do you think would happen to the koalas? So you can see that domino effect there. So specialist species in particular are super sensitive to environmental changes. And then it's estimated that 25% of the eucalyptus species are actually threatened with extinction. So think about the impact that that would have on the koalas and other animals that need those plants for food. And then in our next little video, this one I found really interesting. I don't know if you guys remember all those forests, those fires that were happening in Australia due to record-breaking temperatures and severe drought. Millions of acres of forest and land were burned in these wildfires. So you can see lots of habitat loss and you can see how it impacted the koalas as you see in that video. And it was estimated that more than 1,000 koalas unfortunately died in those bushfires, but also think of the millions of acres of land that was burned and all those trees and food resources that were lost. And then our next example is with the Kincaid's lupine. You see that beautiful plant here and a cool insect called the fender blue butterfly. So the Kincaid's lupine is a threatened plant and it's important because it's the primary larva food for this butterfly here, the fender blue butterfly. And this blue butterfly is actually an endangered species. Both of these are only found in the state of Oregon. And so it's important to note that if we lose the lupine, this fender blue butterfly is not going to have a food source and it's not going to be able to reproduce and thrive. And then our next topic that we're going to take a look at are keystone species. And keystone species are simply a species on which other species in an ecosystem largely depend on. And if that keystone species were removed, the entire ecosystem would change drastically. So an example here in the US would be the saguaro cacti, and it's a keystone species. It's found in, for example, Arizona, California, and Mexico. And these plants, these cacti, it takes at least 50 years for them to mature and flower. And it'll be another 75 years before they start to develop those huge side branches. These cacti can live for well over 200 years. They can get up to 50 feet high and 10 feet wide. So it's definitely on my bucket list to visit one of these states that has these wonderful cacti. But these cacti are super important because they provide food, water, and shelter for all those desert animals. Those flowers, as you see here, not only are they beautiful, but they provide nectar for bats, birds, and other insects. So especially in the desert area, this might be the only food source for a lot of those animals. And then during the summertime, they produce a fruit, and that fruit is food for those summer animals that are there. And it's important during times of drought because animals will go here for nutrition and water. And it's also an important nesting site for birds and also bats, as you see in this picture here. Now, this keystone species is being threatened by an invasive grass called the buffalo grass, as you see over here. And there's been a lot of campaigns to wipe out that buffalo grass. It was brought over from Africa, and it was brought here because they were trying to introduce an increased forage for livestock to eat. And that grass also helps in erosion control, but the only problem was it spread exponentially, and it's starting to overpower and outcompete the cacti for resources. So this cactus over here is, their population numbers are being hurt by that invasive grass, that buffalo grass. And then my last thing is a quick challenge for you guys. Research an extinct, endangered, or threatened plant in your state. Find out its scientific name. Also research why is it declining and how would its absence affect the ecosystem as a whole. So I'm going to go ahead and stop our screen share, and that's all I have for you guys on plant extinction. So we're going to give it back to Dr. Gorman, and he's going to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ramirez. And the question is, where can we find a list of extinct and endangered plants in the local area? And you can go to www.wildflower.org. And that's actually a site that's sponsored by the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. You teachers would know Lady Bird Johnson. You students may not know her. And now we're going to let Ms. Fuller tell us about animal examples for species extinction affecting ecosystems.
Good morning, boys and girls. Over my shoulder is the pelt of a deer, and here is the skull of a deer. We're going to be talking about how the removal of certain species, either predators or keystone species, affects an ecosystem. Let me put this deer down. All right, now I have a couple of questions for you to follow along as we go through this section of the lesson. And the first one says, please answer these two questions as you watch this segment. You can answer them in your science notebook. Number one, why are apex predators necessary to a healthy ecosystem? And the second one, what two effects did passenger pigeons have on the formation of the eastern forests of the United States? So let me go ahead and share my screen with you. And we're going to look at some of these aspects. So the title of this segment is Species Extinction Effect on Existing Populations, how the extinction of animal species could affect the surviving populations in a community. Now remember, community is all the plants and animals. Well, the first one we're going to start with is a classic case called the kaibab. Kaibab is a forest in northern Arizona, and on the right-hand side you see a picture of President Teddy Roosevelt. He was a great outdoorsman, and when he went there and saw the quality of the deer, he was quite impressed, and he wanted to save this particular forest and area so the deer could the population could get larger. And so there were 4,000 of these deer, and the carrying capacity for that area was 30,000. So what they did, this was in 1905, 1906. So what they did was they eliminated hunting of the deer so that the deer population would grow larger. Then they started eliminating the apex predators. Now, the apex predators are the predators at the top of the food pyramid, at the top of the food chain, that nobody hunts them. They do the hunting. And in this particular place, of course, it was in the American Southwest, so you know what the apex predators are. So the elimination of the apex predators through hunting and trapping, they killed 816 mountain lions, 20 wolves, 7,388 coyotes, and 500 bobcats. Now, this took place over the course of several years, about 18 to 20 years. What happened was the deer population exploded with no hunting, either by man or by the apex predators. The deer population just bloomed. There was also overgrazing going on with livestock. Well, between all these factors pressuring the deer population, the deer became weak and sickly. They did not look like what Teddy Roosevelt had witnessed in 1905. And then they decided to open up deer season again to people. They started hunting, and they killed about 60,000 deer, and that was only 1/10 of the fawns that had been born that year. And between two winters, 24 and 25, 60,000 deer starved to death. So they realized that by removing the apex predators, they essentially doomed these deer. Now, there's two kinds of extinction. There's the kind we think of with the dinosaurs where they're completely gone. That's global extinction. But there's another kind called ecological extinction, and that's the reduction of a species to such a low abundance, though it's still present in the community, it no longer interacts significantly with other species. This is the kind of extinction we had in the kaibab, the extinction of the apex predators. Well, the apex predators, what they do is they eat the weak ones, they eat the baby ones, they eat the old ones, they keep the population from getting out of control. And as a result, it preserves not just the animals, but also the soil and the plants. And if deer or elk are allowed to grow too much or without the pressure of apex predators, they'll stay in one place, eat everything to the ground, erosion occurs. There's nothing to eat, not only for the deer, but for the other herbivores. It's very devastating to an ecosystem. So apex predators are very important. And the other thing happens is when these deer population grow huge, they can carry on what are called zoonotic diseases, things like leptospirosis and giardia, Q fever, tuberculosis, brucellosis. Those are all things that we can catch from them that we don't want. They're very dangerous diseases. So removing the apex predators, making them essentially ecologically extinct, had a devastating effect on the kaibab. Now, the next one, this is probably the most profound extinction event in the United States. In the 1800s, there were probably maybe as many as 1 billion, multiple millions of this bird. It's called the passenger pigeon, and it had a really a profound effect on the formation of the eastern forests in the United States. They flew in these huge flocks that you can see in the picture on the left. And what they would do when they got through the forest, they would all get in the canopy of the forest and mash on the forest canopy and break it, which allowed sunlight to come through and reach the forest floor. Also, they were making lots and lots of guano, that's another word for bird droppings, and which of course added nitrogen to the forest floor. So they allowed sunlight to come in, they added this wonderful guano to it, and and they would move from section to section in the forest, causing these little like islands of intense biodiversity. So once they were gone, all of that ceased. So And see, this just simply goes over what I just said. The forests were negatively impacted after the extinction of the passenger pigeon. Okay, now here's Australia, going back to Ms. Ramirez. This animal on the left that looks like your grandmother's lapdog is actually a dingo, a wild dog. And in some places in Australia, he has become ecologically extinct due to overhunting. And so what happened is then, very similar to the kaibab, this allowed the kangaroo population to explode, and they're grazers. And there's a lot has been made about the import of the European rabbit to Australia and the damage it's done. Actually, when you remove the dingo and the kangaroos are allowed to overgraze, it even has a more profound effect. So this is another case of removing the apex predator and essentially destroying the ecosystem. The little sweet face down at the bottom on the right is a wombat, which is another herbivore that would be affected by this. And there we go. There's our overgrazing by the kangaroos, by the removal of the apex predator, the dingo. And finally, here in the United States, the bison, American bison, is a keystone species. A keystone species is a species in which other species in an ecosystem largely depend, such that if it were removed, the ecosystem would change drastically. And of course, you know what happened in the 1800s. These were severely, there were millions of them, just like the passenger pigeon, but they were slaughtered for hides, for meat, for their heads, and also to harm the indigenous people of America, the American Indians. Well, these guys did a lot of work in the Central Plains. They've got real sharp hooves. They did a lot of aerating with their hooves. Of course, they ate a tremendous amount and they pooped a tremendous amount. There were corridors, migration corridors all through the central part of the Central Plains. The little bird over on the left is a parasitic bird called a cowbird, and they followed the bison herds and were on these margins. Well, their lifestyle had to change when all of this changed, and so now they are predatory on the nest of American songbirds. And the grasses changed too. So this business of the extinction, now the American bison was ecologically extinct, and it is now coming back. That we were at one time down to 1,000 buffalo or bison, American bison, and now the numbers are coming up. So it's not globally extinct, but the way it operated was. So let me get out of this. So I'm going to stop my share. Okay, here we go. So let's go back to our two questions. Why are apex predators necessary to a healthy ecosystem? They kill the weak, they keep the population in check, they keep the soil from eroding, from being overgrazed, all kinds of it keep zoonotic diseases down. And number two, what two effects do passenger pigeons have on the formation of the eastern forest? They broke the canopy so the sunlight could reach the understory, and they also supplied a tremendous amount of guano. And here's an activity for you to do at home. Read about the kaibab on your computer and then reflect how good intentions. Teddy Roosevelt didn't mean for this to be destroyed. He meant for it to be preserved. But what happened was the kaibab was destroyed. How can good intentions have negative effects on ecosystems? And record your reflection in your science notebook. My time is up. I must go. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Gorman.
Thank you, Ms. Fuller. And the question, how many animals become extinct annually worldwide? The Wildlife Organization estimates that about 1% of the endangered animals actually will become extinct. There are estimated 2 million animals on the planet that are endangered, so we lose up to 2,000 animals annually off the endangered list and become extinct. And now Ms. Nash is going to talk to you about invasive plants.
Well, welcome to my classroom, students. Yes, we are in the midst of the 6th grade extinction event of our planet. So what can we do? Lots of things we can do. Educate ourselves. First of all, let's talk today about invasive species of plants. The space invaders are here. Let's see who they are and talk about what we can do, possibly, hopefully, to control them and their negative effects on the ecosystem. And so don't let this happen to you. Don't stand in one place too long. Okay, so this is an example of sorry, I get away somewhere. There we go. I'm sorry. There we go. This is an invasive species, kudzu, and they can become really out of control. So this plant is covered up all the trees, it's covering buildings. If you stand still too long, it may cover you up. Most of these plants that we're going to talk about were brought intentionally to a new ecosystem, exotic. They were exotics. They were brought in because someone thought they would look nice in their garden. Others were brought in accidentally as seeds, perhaps in another plant or on the shoes of someone. But the problem is that they escape the garden and then they can take over the native ecosystem. So in their original habitat, they had an insect that might have controlled them, and those things are not present in the new habitat. So then they can become almost impossible to control. I won't let go. Let's go. There we go. So here are a few of our local rogues gallery. And you may see most of these plants around you every day. And these are ones that are common right here where we are today. So if you go to White Rock Lake, you'll see these elephant ears along the shore. If you go anywhere, you'll see this Japanese honeysuckle growing along. People love it. It's so beautiful. No, red. Here's privet, Chinese privet. Here's English ivy covering a tree. Here's bamboo, which never plant this. And if anyone plants it in your neighborhood, watch out. It's coming for you. And then Nandina. Okay. People plant this, they think it's lovely. Notice all the berries. This one has berries, this one has berries, this one has berries. And then Chinese tallow down here also has berries and Johnson. Now, people like them and birds love those berries, and they're the ones that are spreading them. Besides people bringing them originally, then with the berries, the birds fly far and wide and can, in their droppings, plant new plants of whatever kind. If you go around to any park in Dallas, okay, you will find this one growing around. You'll see this growing, okay, completely overwhelming the native understory. So the big trees are pretty safe from most of these. Were brought in as shrubs or ornamentals of some kind. But the understory now has no diversity. Which is bad for all the other animals all the plants that used to live there and all the other animals that depended on them. Like Ms. Ramirez was saying, there's a connection between the plants and the insects and then the other animals. Okay. So one thing we can do is remove them. So we can see people here working hard in all kinds of different habitats to remove those plants. It's really hard work and almost overwhelming. As someone who's tried to remove a lot of Johnson grass from my life, it just comes back. So digging, pulling, and then we have a few what we call biological controls. They've tried importing pests from the original habitat to a new habitat, which can also be problematic. You don't know what that's going to do either. And then you can also pen goats into a small area, and because they will eat a wide variety of things, not so much grass as vines and other things and shrubs, they can be used as a biological control. And here's a little example of a plant that we don't have here, but they do up in the Northeast, called Japanese barberry. It's got really sharp thorns, so deer don't like to browse it. It doesn't taste very good to them. Again, it's got these little seeds that the birds are eating and then spreading around. But the problem is that this plant affects the herbivore or the insect biomass, okay, and all the diversity, not just the biomass, the detritivore that eats the things that are falling down dead, and the diversity. These are all affected directly because they don't like to eat this. Right? They don't like to eat it. So their numbers and their diversity are affected. And then again, the things that ate them, the little predators, all the way up the food chain are affected. And even the soil composition. Okay? They affect the acidity of the soil. So really amazing effects. And the other kind of interesting thing is that it creates a really great habitat for ticks. Okay? So those ticks can spread disease to animals, including humans. Okay? So really not a good thing to have. All right. So what can you do? First is educate yourself. And I'd like you to start, see if you can notice some of those rogues gallery of invaders, common invaders around here. And if you have anything in your garden or your schoolyard, you might talk to whoever's in charge and see if you can remove them. Okay? Have them removed and replaced by native plants. Because the native plants are the ones that native insects and birds and other animals depend upon. So we all have a part to play in this. Don't plant them intentionally. Educate yourself. Right? And if your local nursery is selling them, remind them that that plant is invasive. Another kind of interesting thing about those invaders is that in California, when they had those terrible fires, you saw the fire in Australia. One reason it is so awful is that eucalyptus burns like a candle. They explode. They've got so much oil in the leaves that they're just horrible. So those invaders and other kinds of grass invaders, they alter the fire ecology of an area. So lots of kind of cascading effects, okay, from one single plant. And if you have any questions, you can ask Dr. Corman.
Thank you, Ms. Nash. The question is, what are some of the top invasive plants in the United States? Ms. Nash covered most of these, but the list is kudzu, Japanese honeysuckle, English ivy, Norway maple, and Japanese barberry. That is some of the main ones. And now, Mr. Monroe is going to talk to you about invasive animals.
Good morning, students. My name is Mr. Monroe, and we're going to be investigating some of the invasive species animals, okay? And we do have quite a few here in the state of Texas. And as we get ready to travel down that road of investigation, I'm going to share my screen with you guys. And we're going to look at a short PowerPoint. You're going to hear me talk about some of the invasive species of animals that we have right here on site. So hopefully you'll get an understanding about the importance of eliminating these species of animals so that our ecosystems can be healthy. Bear with me just for a minute. invasive species in Texas. We're going to predict how an invasive species may alter the food chain in an ecosystem. What an invasive species is, we'll go over that. How many are there in Texas? Well, there's quite a few, and we may not get an accurate count on that. What are some examples? How do they get here? What problems have they caused? And how can we control them? Now, I want you to write down these 3 questions. And as we go through the presentation, if you have a chance to answer them, go ahead and answer them at the end of the PowerPoint. But listen, if you don't have a chance to answer them by the end of the presentation, this is something that you can do later on, okay? Number 1, name 3 characteristics that define an invasive species. Name an example of how they can be introduced. Give 1 example of how they can affect a food chain or ecosystem. List 3 examples of invasive species found right here in Texas. Now, when we talk about an invasive species, we're talking about a species that is usually non-native to this area and causes harm to the local ecosystem. It can outcompete native species for resources and cause native species to go extinct or become endangered. It can cause economic damage through harming livestock, crops, personal property, or even water supplies. They typically do not have a natural predator to keep their population in check, and they usually can reproduce very quickly. How many invasive species are there in Texas? As you can see, there are 67 terrestrial plants, 12 aquatic or wetland plants, 10 mammals, 4 birds, 7 fish, 11 insects, 11 mollusks or crustaceans. As you can see, they do a lot of damage to the Texas economy. As far as agriculture, they create $3.35 billion worth of damage. Ranching, $8.59 billion worth of damage. Fishing, $293 million in damage. And mariculture, $600 million in damage. So invasive species here in this state can really affect the Texas economy. The worst of the worst, salt cedar hydrilla, which Miss Nash has covered plants with you already, giant Salvinia, red imported fire ants, nutria, wild hogs, and zebra mussels. Not yet established are the snakehead fish, the brown tree snake, and the Asian lake mussel. The zebra mussel, oh boy, they are really wreaking havoc in our local reservoirs. Quite a few of our reservoirs, such as Lake Ray Roberts, Lake Tawakoni, Lake Ray Hubbard, have had infestations of zebra mussels. There are even more of our reservoirs here in this state that have had that problem. Now, the zebra mussels, basically, they were brought here through, a roundabout way. And I'll go over that in a little more detail as we move forward. And then we have fire ants. And of course, we know that fire ants, I used to hear about why fire ants appeared simply because we had another ant that was wreaking havoc, the big red ants. And so they brought the fire ants in initially to get rid of the big red ants. Once they did that, it had a negative impact on that ecosystem where they were introduced. It even caused a species called the horned lizard to become endangered. Wild hogs, yes. Wild hogs have really wreaked havoc in this state. In fact, I'll share this with you. Out here at the Post Oak Preserve, we do have a group of wild hogs that are inhabiting the preserve, and they are wreaking havoc. In fact, I'll share this with you. Yesterday, we do know that there was a special hunt going on out here, and the people that were hunting these creatures or these animals, they were hunting from a helicopter, which the state of Texas has made it legal as a way to exterminate or to bring down the numbers of the wild hog. Another name for them, they're called feral pigs. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. In fact, I'll share this with you. 5, 6 years ago, I trapped a very large one in the Post Oak Preserve. He weighed about 500 pounds, and we do know that they can get larger than that. Hydrilla, which is a type of plant, and Miss Nash has covered that about plants. Nutria, the nutria, they're wreaking havoc also. In fact, I did overhear Miss Fuller yesterday mention that there are nutrias somewhere over in her neighborhood. So they're pretty prevalent also. And giant Salvinia. Now, the red imported fire ant, basically, they say that they came by boat and infested goods shipped from South America in the 1930s. Now, I had heard a different story, and I related that story to you earlier about how they were also imported in to get rid of the giant red ants because they had become such a problem. And then the fire ants became a big problem in themselves. We do know that fire ants also can affect any animal that their young has to lay on the ground for a period of time. Even a deer, when those female deer have birth to their baby deer, and if that baby deer doesn't get up off the ground quick enough, or if that baby deer is in an area where there is a fire ant mound, it could be detrimental, even death, to that baby deer. They're that aggressive, okay? The zebra mussels, they came from Russia, and you heard me mention that they came to Texas in a roundabout way. They came in from Russia because ships coming from Russia would come into the Great Lakes, and in the ballast water of the ships, they were transported. And then by personal boats coming to Texas, they were transported here. Nutria was introduced for their fur. Most invasive species were brought by accident or were not intended to spread. Okay, salt cedars reproduce quickly, secrete salt that gets into the soil and doesn't let other plants grow, which that's a defense mechanism for that particular plant. Fire ants destroy crops and kill native plants, and fire ants don't have a predator. Zebra mussels disturb nutrient levels of the lake and can clog up pipes and dams. And wild pigs uproot crops and trees. Now, how can we control them? Pesticides. Introduce new chemicals. What else are you killing when you use pesticides? What are you going to do when you're trying to kill out a plant? Use herbicides, more chemicals. The salt cedars can sprout from roots, so you better get the roots. The salvia, introduce a new natural predator. Now you might have 2 invasive species. Now, restrict the entry. The best method so far. Now, those are the questions I want you guys to answer. I also have another challenge for you. Years ago, Texas Parks and Wildlife was looking at a way to eliminate the abundance of feral pigs. And they came out with a program that they had to terminate right away. That terminated program dealt with putting out baited food that had a poison in that would eliminate the wild hog or eliminate its abundance. So that program did not last. I want you guys to think about that and write out an answer, maybe for your teacher, to why they had to terminate that problem or that program. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen with you guys. And I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Gorman. And if any of you guys have any questions that you might want to ask, maybe he can answer them for you.
Thank you, Mr. Monroe. And yes, we had a very unusual question. Mr. Monroe covered invasive animals in Texas, but this question was, what is the most destructive invasive animal in the world? And I would have never thought about this, but the cane toad in Australia. It was introduced into Australia to control destructive beetles, and they came in sugarcane fields. These toads are poisonous to animals that try to eat them, and there is no predator to help control them, and they're moving across Australia at a fairly rapid pace. So the most destructive invasive species in the world is a cane toad in Australia. And now I'm going to share my screen with you. During this virtual field trip, and make it a little larger, students predicted how the introduction or removal of an invasive species may alter the food chain and affect existing populations in an ecosystem, and predicted how species extinction may alter the food chain and affect existing population in an ecosystem. Plant species extinction and ecosystem, Mr. Maris. Animal species extinction and ecosystem, Ms. Fuller. Invasive plants, Ms. Nash. And invasive animals, Mr. Monroe. Thank you. How did we do, teachers? If you would, go to www.tiny.cc/EEC feedback and fill out a short form and send it to us. We would appreciate it. Hope you guys have a great day. Most importantly, I hope you have a great life. Thank you, and visit us again.